Begin. Good evening. My name's Catherine Hellerstein. I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a professor of Yiddish and Jewish American literature in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. I'd like to welcome you this evening to the 26th annual Patricia Brown Silvers and David Silvers Visiting Scholar Program, hosted by Penn's Jewish Studies program. This year, obviously due to the pandemic that continues, we're holding the Silvers Visiting Scholar Program on Zoom rather than on Penn's campus, and we can only hope that next year maybe we will convene again in person. I'd like to thank Chrissy Walsh, the administrative coordinator for the Jewish Studies program, for hosting and managing the Zoom format, a webinar format of this talk. More than a quarter of a century ago, Patty and David Silvers, both alumni of Penn, established the Silvers Visiting Scholar Program in order to bring a distinguished scholar in Jewish studies to the Penn campus each year, specifically in order to interact with students, faculty, and the larger community. We are very grateful that the Silvers program can bring to Penn scholars whose work is of distinguished intellectual caliber and contemporary relevance, and that has a significant impact upon current intellectual and social issues in the field of Jewish studies and the larger Jewish community. And this evening, I'm especially glad to be able to welcome on this webinar, Patty and David Silvers. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Julian E. Zelizer has been among the pioneers in the revival of American political history. He's that Malcolm Stevenson Forbes class of 1941, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He's also the author and editor of some 22 books, including the prize-winning book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. And he's also written a book called Fault Lines, A History of the United States since 1974, which co-authored with Kevin Cruz, as well as Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party. The New York Times named this book as an editor's choice and one of the 100 notable books in 2020. Most recently, he's written a book called Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. And in the current year, he's publishing 3 new edited volumes, one on Daniel Bell, another on Donald J. Trump, and a third on called The Myth America, not Miss America, but Myth America, Historians' Take on the Biggest Lies and Legends About Our Past, also co-edited. He's currently working on a new book about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the 1964 Democratic Convention. Professor Zelizer, who's published over 1,000 op-eds, has received many fellowships, including from the Brookings Institute, the Guggenheim Foundation, and others. And he hosts a co-hosts a popular podcast called Politics and Polls. Great titles for all of your books, by the way. The title of Professor Zelizer's talk this evening is Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Religious Roots of Progressive Politics. Before we start, let me briefly explain how things are going to work. Professor Zelizer will speak for about 40 minutes, and then he will be happy to entertain questions from you, the audience, for 20 minutes or a little more. The way you'll present your questions is to write them in the Q&A, which is a function on the webinar screen. I will select from these questions and read them out loud. So hopefully everything will go smoothly. And please join me virtually in giving a warm welcome now to Professor Julian Zelizer. And I'm applauding silently.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with you. This is really I'm humbled and honored to be in this series. I want to thank both Chrissy and Catherine who put this all together so well, and for the invitation, Catherine, I appreciate it. And to the Silvers for what seems to be just incredible speaker series. And I'm sorry I'm not on campus. I always love to come to the Penn campus. I think it's very beautiful, and I hope I can be there soon. I want to start by describing really a stunning image that was taken that many of you might have seen from one of the marches from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. This one took place on March 21st, 1965. And it's become one of the most iconic images of the civil rights era. And in the image, you can see Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel with his long white beard and his overflowing curly hair, walking arm in arm with prominent civil rights activists. Bearing a proud smile, he marches in solidarity next to a more solemn-looking Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to his left, and former United Nations Undersecretary General for Special Political Affairs, Ralph Bunche, on his right. Heschel and Martin Luther King glance to the camera as if to signal to the photographer that they understand the historic weight of the moment. The clashes that took place just 2 weeks earlier on the Edmund Pettus Bridge before this photograph was shot, where police had attacked protesters who were peacefully marching in support of a historic bill to protect African-American voting rights, moved Heschel to accept King's invitation to fly down south for this march. For many Jewish Americans, this black and white photograph is a testament to the enduring connections between religion and progressive politics. Heschel stood at the nexus of a group of religious leaders in the 1960s who linked tradition, theology, and ritualistic practice to the fight against social injustice. To this day, Heschel remains a symbol of his generation's struggle to make Jewish values relevant to post-World War II America through civic action. The photograph takes us back to a period when organized religion was booming throughout the United States. With the Cold War against communism underway in the 1940s and 50s, Americans rushed to join churches and synagogues. Religion proved attractive to millions who sought solace from the anxiety about the possibility of nuclear war, and they found that solace in houses of religious worship. Suburbanization throughout the country created physical space and pools of congregants to justify a breakneck speed of new church and synagogue construction. During this period, there was a sizable cohort of spiritual leaders who were deeply involved in progressive political movements. From the struggle for civil rights to the mobilization against the quagmire in Vietnam, it was common to find idealistic young college students marching side by side with older preachers. In our current era, when religious politics has become pretty synonymous with conservative politics, we often forget the vital presence of rabbis, priests, and others on the left who perceived a direct connection between their theological beliefs and the struggle to achieve social and economic equality, as well as world peace. There was a robust universe of clergy and religious organizations who built on the tradition of the social gospel movement in the early 20th century. After World War II, in the wake of the Holocaust and the use of the atomic bomb, where there was a grave threat that democracy had faced from totalitarianism, religious leaders from a broad range of denominations took to the streets to fight for social justice. In Life and Death, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, came to embody this particular religious ethic. There was a strong relationship between the Jews and the left in the United States ever since the influx of Eastern Europeans into the country after the 1880s. Jews were prominent figures in many of the major political movements that took form in the 20th century, including unionism, early civil rights activism, communism, anarchism, civil rights in the 1960s, New Deal liberalism, and much more. Given the economic deprivation, anti-Semitism, and carnage that Heschel experienced with his own family, starting as a boy in Europe, as well as through his understanding of the Hebrew prophets, when the civil rights movement took hold, Heschel was primed to support Black American activists. Like many of the Jews of this era, some of whom were active in politics and others who were not, Heschel espoused a worldview that was shaped and influenced by the trauma of the Holocaust. I live in Auschwitz, he said. Since Auschwitz, I only have one rule of thumb for what I say. Would it be acceptable to those who were burned there? The Holocaust had been intensely personal for this Eastern European immigrant. All but one of the women in his birth family died in the genocide. One of his sisters was killed in the German bombing of Poland. Two of his sisters died in concentration camps, and his mother passed from a heart attack when German police broke into her home. In Heschel's mind, and among his like-minded allies, the atrocities committed against Jews only amplified the need for spiritual religion to help rid the world of evil and ensure that such depravity didn't happen again. Rather than concluding that secular society posed an inevitable threat to religion, Heschel came to perceive how religion could make secular society a better place for everyone. He devoted the last decade of his life to joining a global fight for human rights for African Americans, Soviet Jews, the Vietnamese who were suffering in a proxy war between global superpowers and other disenfranchised peoples. Nothing was inevitable about Heschel's progressive piety. The relationship between religion and politics swung many ways, including during his own lifetime. During the early Cold War, conservative forces also used religion as a bludgeon to combat liberalism. Southern preachers relied on scripture in defense of racial segregation. The Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, a group that was founded in 1953, was one of several right-wing organizations that spoke about God and man in the name of a rightward crusade targeting the left. Despite this long lineage of religious conservatism, Heschel dedicated himself to carving out space in the 1960s for those who believed in the connections between spirituality and progressive politics. To be a pious person came to mean to him and his allies mobilizing against social injustice and militarism in the lived world. With an uncanny instinct for promoting his ideas and himself, Heschel gained prominence in several grassroots campaigns. Though other colleagues spent much more time in the trenches organizing, he was often willing to speak out against injustice when fellow religious Jewish leaders remained silent about Vietnam, for example. And he had a keen sense of the power and symbolism in words, spirituality, and direct action of religion. He used his persona and his publications as tools for trying to move public opinion on unpopular issues and for providing religious support to those who were fighting power. Tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about Heschel's role in the movement against Vietnam between 1965 to the time of his death in 1972. Following the period when he joined the Jewish Theological Seminary as a professor in 1945, which took place after he was rescued from Eastern Europe by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where he worked as a fellow and a faculty member for about 5 years, from 1940 to 1945, Heschel had spent the 1950s producing a number of books that gained national attention. Man is Not Alone, The Sabbath, God in Search of Man, and The Prophets, which was a book that was a revision of his dissertation at the University of Berlin. He had become, before the 1960s, a pretty well-known figure, covered in popular magazines like Newsweek and Time, a regular speaker on the synagogue and university speaking circuit. He had started to become engaged in political activism after he revised the Prophets, which again had been his doctoral dissertation, and he finished those revisions in the early 1960s as the civil rights movement was flourishing. And in the early 60s, he spent time on the civil rights issue, becoming a friend and colleague of Martin Luther King. He's very early on one of the first activists fighting here in the country and working with several groups on the issue of Soviet Jewry. And he also fights against anti-Semitic doctrine that was part of the Vatican II deliberations between 1962 and 1965. But I wanted to spend a night again looking at the last few years when he concentrates largely on the war in Vietnam. America's involvement in Vietnam had accelerated in August of 1964 when President Lyndon Johnson persuaded Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted the president sweeping authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. The war in Vietnam had intensified for the United States in March and April of 1965, after Johnson had been reelected in 1964. First, the president accelerates a bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese and then starts to send ground troops into the region. Although most people who knew about the conflict supported US involvement, and most Americans didn't really know much in 1965, Heschel jumped right into this brewing battle early on. In 1965, before there was much of an anti-war movement to speak of, he would become part of an interfaith alliance, coalition, fighting against this policy. Worse than war is the belief in the inevitability of war, he put down on a note. Heschel followed the events in Southeast Asia in the newspapers and on the nightly news with growing concern. On October 25th, 1965, he joined approximately 100 preachers at the United Nations Church Center here in New York City, who gathered to support the right to protest the war, and who argued that the Johnson administration was starting to try cracking down on protesters. Heschel's work in the Second Vatican II and his experience with civil rights leaders like King had laid the groundwork and created a model for interfaith political cooperation. He had previously worked with the Union Theological Seminary president John Bennett, for instance, during a push for racial integration in New York City schools. Richard John Newhouse, a Lutheran from Ontario, served as the pastor at St. John the Evangelist Church in Williamsburg, and he had been arrested during a sit-in at the New York City Board of Education demanding racial integration. Another of the preachers who was at this meeting was Daniel Berrigan, a poet who had gone with his brother Philip to the march in Washington in 1963 and been very inspired and moved by what he saw. And another person who was there with Heschel at this first meeting was Yale University chaplain William Sloane Coffin, who had been arrested for acts of disobedience, including participating in the Freedom Rides. The founders of the group that comes out of this early meeting, they call themselves Clergy Concerned About Vietnam. With human beings being killed and wounded, Heschel and his colleagues said in an announcement, religious leaders must, in principle, issue a clear call to see the way toward peace. Heschel and his colleagues quickly shifted their focus from the protection of the right to protest to condemning the war itself. Perhaps because they were all comfortable working through established institutions in their professional lives, the group proved to be pretty effective early on at building an organization of their own without resources to speak of. They established local committees in every state. Heschel and his colleagues, who were working without the formal support of national religious organizations to which they were connected, used church and synagogue bureaucracies and membership mailing lists to grow their own membership. They took lessons learned from the civil rights movement by sponsoring church resolutions, for example, at national conventions, and placing ads in local newspapers calling for a negotiated end to the war. Relying on volunteers from the seminaries at Morningside Heights, Coffin worked the phones to put together an extensive network of contacts. They turned to independent journals like the Christian Century to disseminate their ideas. By the end of the year, despite meager financial resources, the committee claimed 68 chapters and a 41-person national committee. Heschel and his fellow clergy were out front on this issue, again, long before an anti-war movement had taken hold in this country. Their early involvement was important because it helped to bring some legitimacy to a cause that was seen as extremely radical. In 1966, they renamed themselves the Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam, CalCav, as I'll refer to it for the rest of the talk, hoping to enhance their appeal beyond only clergy. They hired a full-time executive editor, Richard Fernandez, who was an ordained minister from the United Church of Christ, who had been arrested earlier in the decade during civil rights protests, to create a, quote, public climate in which the administration can and must seek alternatives to current policy. CalCav established a literature division to distribute publications, an action division to organize vigils and services, and an education division that had a speakers program for outreach to schools and churches, synagogues, and to develop promotional films and public displays. In contrast to early proponents of burning draft cards, CalCav would act lawfully, and they wouldn't endorse any kind of no confidence vote in President Johnson. In their minds, the radicalization of certain parts of the anti-war movement threatened to undercut its legitimacy among mainstream Americans and elected officials. The anti-war mobilization lacked the kind of centralized cadre of leaders that the civil rights movement had enjoyed. And while the fragmentation offered the clergy an opportunity to quickly gain influence, it also meant that more radical elements were always at the highest levels of power. On foreign policy, they encountered many mainstream Democratic politicians who, while very liberal on social issues, embraced a vision of liberal internationalism and anti-communism, where their bias was to purge anyone from the left from their ranks. Getting too close to certain parts of the anti-war movement in the 1960s threatened to undercut their hard-earned standing. By focusing on moral appeals, invoking religion, and holding peaceful rallies and alliances with reputable political organizations, the presence of preachers and rabbis, CalCav believed, could bolster the anti-war cause among elected officials in ways that long-haired students on college campuses could not. We came into being specifically to provide a religious comment on the war, Heschel said. That would not be allied to the traditional peace movement, and that did not stem from a body committed to its own continuation beyond the cessation of the present crisis. CalCav was a living experiment in the kind of interfaith dialogue that Heschel had come to believe was so crucial. As he proclaimed in a speech at the Union Theological Seminary, where he was the first Jew to serve on the faculty as a visiting scholar in 1965, he said in a speech called "No Religion Was an Island," "We fail to realize that while different exponents of faith in the world of religion continue to be wary of ecumenical movement, there is another ecumenical movement worldwide in extent and influence: nihilism. We must choose between interfaith and internihilism." He said, "Cynicism is not parochial. Should religions insist upon the illusion of complete isolation?" Heschel described Vietnam as an ecumenical nightmare. Christians, Jews, Buddhists dying together, killing one another. He said, so soon after Auschwitz, so soon after Hitler. The response to the Nazi atrocities, he said, should have been a revival of the conscience. The pentagons of the world are temples, he said, where decisions were now being made about how many shall live, how many shall die, a reference to the prayer that Jews chant on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur while contemplating the fate of every individual in God's final judgment. Religion cannot be the same after Auschwitz and Hiroshima, Heschel insisted. Its teaching must be pondered not only in the halls of learning, but also in the presence of inmates in extermination camps and in the sight of the mushroom of a nuclear explosion. The religiously infused rhetoric that Heschel and his colleagues employed didn't sit well with many supporters of the anti-war movement as it grew. Unlike the civil rights movement, where Black American preachers and churchgoers were at the forefront of activism from the very start, the anti-war movement was largely secular in orientation. Most mainstream religious organizations were not on the side of the protesters. Within the Jewish community, for example, Heschel's positions were highly controversial and unpopular. With regards to Vietnam, there were particular concerns within the Jewish community about the political risks of Heschel's outspoken opinions in relation to President Lyndon Johnson's support for Israel. One of the foremost reasons that so many Jewish organizations avoided taking a strong stand on the war, despite their having committed to civil rights, was that they either stood by the president or they would be silent. The Rabbinical Assembly, for example, opposed what Heschel was doing. In January of 1967, the Rabbinical Assembly declared their full support for the military operations in Southeast Asia and criticized clergy, like their colleague, for exercising, quote, poor judgment. They said, "We deplore the efforts by the so-called guardians of the faith, organized under the name Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam, to embarrass our government and elected officials, having prejudged and condemned our government and its policies beforehand." Nor did many of Heschel's colleagues on the faculty of JTS support his outspoken positions on the war. Heschel found solace, for sure, that there were some prominent Jewish leaders and a handful of groups, most in the Reform movement, who agreed with his unpopular stand. Rabbi Balfour Brickner, the rabbi of the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue, had nothing good to say about America's involvement in Vietnam and expressed profound frustration that so many Jews were remaining silent about the war. More difficult than the hostility of colleagues was the fact that Johnson's positions didn't really change. The realization that Heschel had about Vietnam was the war would not be ending anytime soon, absent more grassroots pressure. Words alone would not sway the administration. Troop numbers kept rising along with the draft calls. In 1966, 385,000 troops were deployed, 382,000 people were drafted. Whereas Heschel had been something of an interloper in the civil rights protests until Selma, he took on a leadership role in these anti-war demonstrations. With CalCav, he had entered into the movement at the ground level before the opposition was a national presence. The anti-war mobilization had just started to materialize in a substantial way in the spring of 1967. 2 months before an anti-war demonstration was to take place in several cities across America, anticipated to be the largest showing thus far against the war, CalCav put together its own mobilization in Washington, D.C. from January 31st to February 1st, 1967. One of the flyers used to promote the event, entitled "Vietnam, the Clergyman's Dilemma," began by saying, "Scripture warns that where there is no vision, the people perish." The failure of vision regarding Vietnam is a blindness to realities no less than to ideals. Their flyer said that the threat of this moment is a preoccupation with the enemy that destroys our society's power to understand itself or its foes. In such a time, leaders in the religious community of the nation must risk the displeasure of the powers that be in order to challenge dogmatisms that imperil ourselves and our world. The executive committee of the group released a statement to the press, which circulated among participants, and it said, quote, "A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. As members of America's churches and synagogues, we voice not only our own convictions, but we seek to articulate the unexpressed fears and longings of millions of Americans." Heschel had been in Washington several times, but this moment was different. He was arriving to the nation's capital in 1967 as a leader in an influential organization that was at the very center of a movement shaking American politics. His first time in Washington had been back in 1943, when he was part of something called the Rabbis' March that protested President Roosevelt's apparent indifference to the plight of Eastern Europeans suffering and dying under Nazi power. Now, more than 2 decades later, he was standing in the middle of what could possibly become one of the biggest grassroots movements that had taken place in this country. Heschel was among the more than 2,000 clergy and religious lay people who traveled to Washington. Their first stop was the White House. They held a vigil, filling 2 city blocks. Angry counter-protesters hurled insults and waved blistering signs. They next moved on to Capitol Hill, where the members broke up into smaller delegations organized by states to lobby particular representatives and senators. About 100 members from Illinois confronted Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, a Republican who had supported voting rights, but was a firm backer of the war. When the senator told Kalkav that you can't surrender, you can't retreat, they interrupted him in mid-sentence to ask why. Senator Fulbright, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, says stop bombing and start negotiations with the Viet Cong. Heschel was really hitting his stride. The first evening of this mobilization, as the clergy reconvened in Washington's Presbyterian Church, Heschel took to the pulpit as one of the keynote speakers after the singing of a few Christian hymns. Feeling the urgency of the moment, Heschel tossed aside restraint and let out a litany of harsh words. This is an assembly, he said, of shock, contrition, and dismay. Who would ever have believed that we peace-loving Americans are capable of bringing death and destruction to so many innocent people? Instead of projecting power through military might, the United States, he said, should offer assistance to those who are suffering. He asked, must napalm stand in the way of our power to aid and to inspire the world? Heschel understood the difficult challenges that leaders in government face, but the war had to stop. And any pious person needed to realize that, quote, to speak about God and remain silent on Vietnam is blasphemous. He lamented that, quote, the sword is the pride of man. Arsenals, military bases, nuclear weapons lend supremacy to nations. War is the climax of ingenuity, the object of supreme dedication, man slaughtering each other, cities battered and ruined. Such insanity, he said, has plunged many nations into an abyss of disgrace. Heschel spoke with the conviction of a religious leader driven to action. Paraphrasing the words of Isaiah, he said, for Vietnam's sake, I will not keep silent. For America's sake, I will not rest until the vindication of humanity goes forth as brightness and peace for all man as the burning church. He shared his memories of learning the story of Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. Heschel concluded with the story of a 7-year-old boy who read that when Abraham had lifted his arm in preparation of killing his son, he remembered breaking down in tears. Heschel recounted that the Rebbe asked him, why was he crying? And the boy responded, what if the angel had been late? According to the Rebbe, an angel cannot be late. Heschel then looked toward the anti-war activists who were sitting on the edge of their seats, listening to every word he said with bated breath, and he reminded them, man made of flesh and blood may be late. Heschel made it clear that for a pious person, there was nothing more vital at the moment than bringing an end to this horrendous war. At this hour, Vietnam is our most urgent, our most disturbing religious problem, biblical problem, a challenge to the whole nation, as well as a challenge to every one of us as an individual. Eager to recruit other well-known figures to join the cause, the group went right after the most famous activist of the decade, Martin Luther King, by inviting him to speak at the Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967. The magnificent 392-foot high church sat in Morningside Heights, one of the highest points in the city. Since his first appearance at the church on August of 1961, King had given several sermons about civil rights there. Heschel, along with Coffin and Brown, had been urging King to take a public stand against the war. Upon receiving the invitation, King worried about alienating himself and in the process alienating the civil rights movement. The opposition to the Vietnam War was intensifying, but in the spring of 1967, it was perceived by much of the political establishment and among most mainstream American middle-class voters, still a radical movement. Polls found that support for the operations in Vietnam stood at about 70%. Among African Americans surveyed at that time, approval was at about 50%. But King, who had resisted coming out against the war other than in a few low-key speeches, decided he had reached a breaking point. Black Americans were also bearing a disproportionate burden in the war. Just as he turned his attention to economic equality, King understood that Vietnam was one of the most damaging developments for African Americans. As the death toll kept mounting for Americans and Vietnamese, King decided that he couldn't remain silent, and he decided to break his silence in a big way at this event that CalCav had organized. Before a rapt audience of 3,000 people at the Riverside Church, with a speech drafted with the assistance of CalCav staffers, King denounced the war as immoral. Heschel sat in a seat to the right of him, right next to the lectern. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, King warned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. King also agreed to serve as the national co-chairman on the executive committee. Heschel spoke out at the Riverside Church as well, condemning the war as a, quote, supreme example of extreme absurdity. The longer we stay in Vietnam, he said, the more we lose morally. Heschel argued that the blood we shed in Vietnam makes a mockery of all our proclamations, dedications, celebrations. Drawing on his own theological writing, Heschel warned that nobody could escape being culpable of, quote, the agony and merciless killing done in our name. In a free society, some are guilty and all are responsible. The CalCav event was historic for King, for Heschel, and for the anti-war movement in general. Securing King's support was a major accomplishment as he now became part of this anti-war movement. In the words of the historian Peniel Joseph, Riverside marked King's transition from a civil rights leader into a political revolutionary, one who refused to remain quiet in the face of domestic and international crisis. Notwithstanding the attacks, the rhetoric of religious leaders like King and Heschel offered something really vital to the movement that was still perceived by so many people as radical. As they did with civil rights, these preachers and rabbis framed the mission in dramatic terms that drew out the ethical dimension of the cause with great clarity. Their language had the ability to mobilize activists, and because of the speaker's public standing in even pretty moderate communities, their words seeped into media coverage so that broad groups of Americans were exposed to the description they were offering of this war. In a country where many middle-class citizens attended churches and synagogues, Heschel's arguments, though highly sensational and sometimes they could be histrionic, connected the campaign to end the war in Southeast Asia to the moral lessons learned in services, far from the dangerous leftist images that conservatives talked about. When CalCav, which was being secretly monitored by the FBI, published a book entitled Vietnam, Crisis of Conscience, with essays by Heschel and King, The paperback sold over 50,000 copies within a year and made the front page of 14 major newspapers. Booksellers all over New York, Richard Fernandez recalled, were calling to ask, "Where's the book? Where's the book?" One of Heschel's friends, a businessman named Harry Wachtell in Long Island, who worked with the civil rights movement, paid to have this book of speeches sent to every member of Congress. Heschel's chapter, The Moral Outrage of Vietnam, expanded on his speech at the Riverside event and offered the clearest written articulation of his prophetic views on the war. "It is weird to wake up one morning," he wrote, "and find that we have been placed in an insane asylum. It is even more weird to wake up and find that we have been involved in slaughter and destruction without knowing it." While Heschel avoided radical forms of protest, the words he was using were becoming as provocative as anything else heard on the college campuses. Openly questioning the premise of American exceptionalism, the notion that the United States was different and better than democracies in Europe, Heschel wrote, "The absurdity of war is tacitly admitted by almost everyone. Is this a way to bring democracy to Vietnam? More explosives, more devastation, more human beings crippled, orphans killed?" He characterized Vietnam as a country that, quote, had been the victim of colonial demoralization. The combined authorship of this book, one reviewer noted, is in itself a testimony to the role of the religious community in the face of the Vietnam conflict. The results of the political analysis are then judged by the values based on biblical faith. Heschel was obsessed with Vietnam. It was almost pathological, one friend recalled. At the UN in New York, he helped to co-organize a CalCav human rights vigil, calling for a, quote, cessation of military hostilities around the world. And more members of this group were starting to engage in activities that they had avoided early on, such as burning draft cards and helping to support conscientious objectors who resisted being drafted. Heschel returned to Washington in February of 1968 for CalCav's second anti-war mobilization. This gathering took place a few days after the Tet Offensive, which further rocked national confidence that the war was ever going to end. On the eve of the protests, CalCav published another book called In the Name of America, which superimposed news accounts of wartime atrocities next to the text of international laws. The goal was to highlight how the United States systematically violated basic international agreements. The booklet sold about 30,000 copies and was distributed to every US senator. The second CalCav mobilization in Washington reflected a heightened sense of national crisis. CalCav had grown into one of the largest anti-war contingents in the country, with over 20,000 members and 96 chapters. Upon arriving in Washington, Heschel made his first stop to the Religious Action Center of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Standing before a half-filled room of protesters, he lamented the fact that America had been a country of hope, but was turning into a land of shame. Looking around the empty seats in his room, he couldn't understand why there were so few Jews participating in the anti-war movement, given that Rahmanis, compassion, was a fundamental Jewish value. On the second day, February 6th, CalCav gathered at the Arlington National Cemetery. Over 40 buses of protesters arrived on a crisp winter morning. The clergy was not deterred by a ruling of the Military District of Washington, which prohibited CalCav from holding a full service and gathering on the grounds the ceremony would be too political. Fernandez argued the decision had been discriminatory, but the court allowed them to conduct a silent vigil, which they did. CalCav made the most of it. Heschel walked alongside King in front of about 2,500 protesters in what they called a procession of agony. Other leaders present included Rabbi Everett Gendler, a progressive rabbi from Princeton, New Jersey, who helped connect King to many civil rights leaders, Andrew Young, the Catholic Bishop James Shannon, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who carried a Torah. Carrying little American flags, and you can Google photos of this, that CalCav had distributed, the protesters walked in silence until Heschel and King reached the steps in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier. When the marchers settled into their places, King called out, "In this period of absolute silence, let us pray." We prayed and waited for our leaders and never spoke, noted Edward Kaplan, then a doctoral student who had been in Washington in '66 and kept diaries of his experience, later becoming a biographer of Heschel. Nor was such a silence more powerful. We challenged the powers of the world, he noted. We engulfed all wars and took them into our personal meditation. We loved those wars and now we were embarrassed. We loved soldiers and we were sad. We thought that God was in that tomb. Around us, time continued and we were small. After 6 minutes, Heschel broke the silence by reading out loud in Hebrew from Psalm 22, my Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" Bishop Shannon followed Heschel by saying, "Let us go in peace. Amen." They marched for half a mile. The protesters returned to the church, which was the base of their operations, where King closed out the day talking about the moral collapse of the United States. These protests drew massive media attention. In all the major papers, you can find pictures of King standing next to Heschel in Arlington. Heschel was wearing a long black overcoat and a beanie, gripping on to his small American flag in front of the tomb. Although many clergy had traditionally backed away from political participation, this was now becoming clear evidence that many more were becoming involved. The relationship between religion and activism worked both ways for Heschel. It was not just that religion informed his understanding of social justice, moving him deeper into the world of protest, but that the pursuit of social justice also was shaping his understanding of religion. He had come to see that achieving piety, as he had outlined in his theological writing in the 50s, was difficult, if not impossible, given the conditions of the world. During one protest, Heschel confessed to a reporter, "Whenever I open my prayer book, I see before me images of children being burnt by napalm." The anti-war movement was massive by the time President Richard Nixon started his term in 1969. And Heschel was one of many thousands of activists, religious and otherwise, who kept taking to the streets. Tactical moderation was losing its appeal, which was clear at the third national Cal-Cav mobilization soon after Nixon was inaugurated. The shift in tone from the clergy was evident, as Cal-Cav was now emphasizing support for amnesty to draft resistors, as much as they were calling for an end to the war. When asked about university students who shut down administration buildings and disrupted campuses, Heschel said they are protesting the hypocrisy and mendacity of our government. We feel that no one should be penalized simply because his eyes were open after entering military service. There was no longer much daylight separating Heschel from the rest of the movement. When Cal-Cav came to Washington with Nixon in the White House, Heschel was now talking about the need to forgive draft resistors. If America cannot forgive those who objected to the war, he said, then it destroys the bridge over which it must pass herself. To receive forgiveness from those who are victims of this war. Cal-Cav now sounded more radical than it had in its founding back in 1965 and 1966. It was issuing position papers which not only called for an end to the Vietnam War, but started to question the basis of the Cold War itself. Cal-Cav, many leaders were calling for the end of the draft and compensating Black citizens who had been harmed disproportionately because of the cost they bore in the fight. Over the next few years, Heschel would start to lose some of his confidence in the entire political system. During an interview with Frank Reynolds on ABC television on Sunday, November 21st, 1971, Heschel voiced his frustration that the war raged on despite the work of the movement. He said, "We are callous to this very day. And to this very day, the American Air Force is bombing certain cities in Southeast Asia. Undoubtedly, innocent victims suffer, and we are indifferent. The war in Vietnam," Heschel said, "had become to me the greatest religious issue. The process of war," he said, "depended on dehumanization. And when dehumanization increased, religion is gone." One thing Heschel never loses through the time of his death in 72 was his belief in the power of protest. Faith and dissent, Heschel argued, were Judaism's two essential ingredients. He explained to the National Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, Judaism in its very essence came into being as an act of dissent from paganism, as an act of nonconformity with the surrounding culture. The greatness of the prophets, Heschel added, was their ability to voice dissent and disagreement not only with the beliefs of their pagan neighbors, but also with the cherished values and habits of their own people. Toward the end of his life, Heschel no longer felt any restraint, and he fully immersed himself in the world of politics. During Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972, Heschel came out and endorsed the Democrat George McGovern. He wrote a letter to the New York Times claiming that the Jewish tradition inevitably pointed to a McGovern presidency. If the prophets Isaiah and Amos were to appear in our midst, he said in the letter, would they accept the corruption in high places, the indifferent way in which the sick, the poor, and the old are treated? Would they not be standing amidst those who protest against the violence of the war in Vietnam? In his lifetime, Heschel helped to carve out space for progressive religious voices on the national and international stage, even as conservative forces tried to reclaim the church and the synagogue for themselves. Clergy and intellectuals, as well as religious organizations, were integral to many of the left-wing movements that swept through the country. Though a majority of activists were secular or atheistic, as they had been for much of the 20th century, there was a notable group of preachers who took to the streets, deeply embedded in their particular theological tradition. Just as Heschel passed, so did the world where progressive piety had come to gain a foothold in American political culture. Heschel gradually seemed like a relic from a bygone era. By the time Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, was elected president in 1980, the moral majority had come to signify the influence of religion in American politics. One side of the religious political leadership relationship came to dominate the public square. The founder of the moral majority, televangelist Jerry Falwell, and other preachers mobilized their congregations from the pews, from radio, and from television, arguing that the logic of faith inevitably pointed to a right-wing agenda of tax cuts, minimal government, restrictions on reproductive rights, and more. Conservative religious voters, evangelicals, Catholics, Protestants, and others became a vital bloc to the new Republican coalition. With each election, conservative pastors and congregants were certain to cast their ballots for the grand old party. According to Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the executive director of TRUA, a progressive rabbinic association, public religious space has largely been claimed by the Christian right. Those who speak from a religious standpoint are assumed to care most about banning abortion and limiting the rights of gay and lesbian Americans, she said. Many progressives worry about speaking from their own religious tradition, that it will lead to a debate about which religion has the better claim to truth, or will unwittingly legitimize others who claim to know God's preferences. Nonetheless, Heschel's insistence on the ways that religious piety and social justice intertwine enriched the meaning of American Judaism in his own lifetime. He and like-minded Jewish American leaders propagated an understanding of their religion that inspired a greater commitment toward fighting for a world that respected human rights and social equality. He teased out key elements of the theology that were too often ignored by middle-class Jewish Americans settling into the material comforts of the suburbs. For progressive movements outside of the Jewish community, Heschel and his generation of preachers offered a spiritual foundation for social justice struggles that were often fought on secular grounds. In a country where religious institutions still held a respected place in mainstream communities, these voices helped grassroots activism appeal to a wider range of the populace, even on the most controversial matters. Heschel tried to answer the spiritual crisis facing the modern world. He saw politics in moral terms. The emptiness of our souls was directly connected to the violence all around us. Jews needed to open themselves up, he said, to the radical amazement of accepting the reality of the divine and living a life where every action was informed by religious values. That will remain his clarion call to action until the terrible wrongs, as Heschel called them, are wiped away, when materialism, social injustice, and unnecessary military force stop claiming the powerful hold they still have on our society. And as the forces of war take hold right now as we speak in Ukraine, let us hope that somehow those who understand the appeals Heschel made in an earlier era find a way to shape conversations in the public square in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. This was a rousing speech and beautiful account of Heschel's contribution to his world and to our world as well. I'll open up the questions with the first question from Lawrence Greenspun. I'll read the question and then let you respond. Lawrence wrote, I was struck by the Rabbinical Assembly's 1967 statement in support of the Vietnam War and in disapproval of those who, like Heschel, spoke out against the war. I'm wondering if any lessons were learned by the Rabbinical Assembly and if it made statements for one side or the other regarding the post 9/11 war in Iraq and the current war against democracy being waged in the United States.
Very good question. And, Heschel was really an outlier. And part of what was interesting is some of the colleagues who had been involved in the civil rights movement, even friends of his, some of the people he was closer with at JTS, they were in a very different place in 1967 with Vietnam. And I think the Rabbinical Assembly proclamation, which I agree is kind of striking to read in retrospect. Most people would think by 1967 the RA might have shifted, reflected where a lot of the professors were, and I think many of the students were. And as I said, some of it was pragmatic, and it was interesting that in parts of the Jewish community, they were very fearful about crossing Lyndon Johnson on this, and they worried about the impact it would have on Israel. And Heschel even had conversations. I think it was, I'd have to see my book, but I believe it was Elie Wiesel he was hearing from other Jews, like, don't come out too much against this. It's not going to be good for the Jewish community. And Heschel just disagreed with that. That wasn't how, you weigh whether action was necessary or not. And so he was an outlier. I mean, there is growing support over these years. There's more, particularly Reform Jews, who are involved in the movement. But I think kind of looking back, it is worth thinking of other key moments of military conflict that were widely seen to be mistakes, such as Iraq. And there's kind of a silence each time from a lot of mainstream organizations. I mean, mainstream religious organizations can be very conservative, not theologically, but politically. And they're often fearful on especially matters of war. And I hope the lesson of a story such as Heschel is not to be that way, but actually kind of that voice of protest is pretty important.
So Elizabeth Fife asked, are there any leaders in the contemporary US Jewish community or communities who have carried on with Heschel's work?
There are. I mean, again, as I said toward the end of the talk, I do feel that the voices of progressive religious leaders have faded in general. They're not what they were in the 1960s for the reasons I outlined, and obviously the growing kind of conservative turn in American politics. But I quoted Jill Jacobs, who is a kind of very significant figure in progressive circles, true as an international organization committed to human rights. And she's really someone, I think, who carries forward with his tradition. Reverend William Barber is another figure some of you might encounter, especially now that you know his name. He's been involved in invigorating the Poor People's Campaign and doing ongoing events to protesting everything from fighting poverty to protecting the democracy, as question one, which I didn't address, said, protecting the right to vote. And those are two examples, and there's others. But again, I think we're in a very different era, even within the Jewish community. I think there's been a kind of a growing presence of conservative Jewish leaders, again, not theologically or denominationally, but in terms of politics, that have crowded out some of this progressive tradition. And I also, and I kind of, in some talks, I talk about this, I think in some ways, Israel and the debates over Israel has become the political question of the day in the Jewish community. It's often come at the expense of some of these other issues like voting rights, which for a Heschel were, as front and center. And so for all of those reasons, the voices are there, but they're much weaker.
Michael Karasik asked, why was Heschel so vehemently against the war so early? And I'd actually like to follow up with the request that maybe you say a little bit more about Heschel's connection between his experiences and losses in Europe during the Nazi period and his early anti-war actions and feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think you already touched on something that is pretty foundational for understanding him, just as a human, as an immigrant story during that period. Again, he is in Germany. He's in Frankfurt in 1938. So he gets his doctorate at the University of Berlin. While he's there, he's watching the Nazis rise to power. Then he's kicked out of the country by the Gestapo. And he's only saved because there's a person named Julian Morgenstern, who's the head of the Hebrew Union College, who's trying to bring Eastern European Jewish intellectuals over as fellows to save them. And through many connections, Heschel becomes one of those people, although he barely gets his visa. And from 1940 to 45, I mean, his own family, many of them perish in the war. He watches his community in Warsaw, where he grew up, just ravaged and destroyed. The first real book he'll write, published, it comes from a speech he gives at YIVO, The Earth is the Lord's. And it's a kind of eulogy and nostalgic look back at the world of Eastern European Jewry that was lost and that had faded. So the war is something that shapes him. I said he's involved in this protest, so he even has a kind of taste of activism. And in the 40 to 45 period, he is really frustrated, not only with the Christian community, but with the Jewish community, which he just thinks is not mobilizing. They're not doing anything as this crisis is unfolding. So I think that stays with him in terms of understanding war and the costs of war. And often when he spoke about the Holocaust, he spoke about the bomb as well. That was to him yet another part of the nightmare of what humanity was doing. Then when he's writing the prophets, I think he's wrestling with these questions again when he's revising his dissertation into the book. It's not only the connection to civil rights, but before Vietnam, he has a line in there, violence is obscene. And he's listening to the prophets on the use of might. So I think when the war starts in 65, or when this group meets in 65, he's kind of primed to see the potential horror of what this will do and how it could unfold. I think that's how he gets there so early, before there's many colleagues working with him.
Thank you. Beth Wenger asks the question, you detail the real challenges that Heschel faced from within the Jewish community, voicing his political opinions, yet the photograph that you referenced when you began the talk is most often invoked as a proof text to demonstrate the ostensibly seamless and unproblematic relationship between Jews and progressive politics. Do you think that Heschel as icon actually obscured the realities of his struggles, especially within the Jewish community?
That's a great question. Hello, Beth, one of our great historians. So not surprising to get a great question. And I think there's truth to that. I mean, in some ways, the book, I don't have it in front of me, but it starts with that image. I kind of have it right up front because it's so iconic. And part of what I wanted to do in this book as an American historian was get you to how did he end up there? How did this immigrant from Warsaw, grows up in a Hasidic community, end up in Selma, in the front lines of a civil rights march? And I think without knowing much and just knowing the photo, which is what most people know, I think Beth is exactly right. I mean, there's ways in which it obscures a lot of the resistance that existed among his colleagues. A lot of the indifference that he's always talking about is the indifference of religious leaders. And then certainly with Vietnam, it kind of obscures the real fault lines that existed and the pushback he encountered at every step when dealing with these kinds of questions. And by obscuring that, you obscure the conservatism that existed back then in religious congregations and organizations that he was fighting against. And I think she's right. At the same time, it's a powerful photograph, and it's still worth a lot. Because even though that struggle is obscured, and even though the complexity of how he was able and others were able to achieve this, I think definitely gets kind of papered over in many popular accounts, it still gets you right to this relationship that was quite important during the 1960s period, and quite effective, I think. So yes and no to Beth. I think though the point is it's an important one, and that's why it's funny. I'm just going to add to that. I mean, a lot of people know about Heschel and civil rights in particular. They at least know that march. The Vietnam story is in part. He's much more involved in the struggle against Vietnam than he is with civil rights as an organizer and kind of on a daily basis. But the story, as I try to outline, unpacks exactly what she's saying. This was not easy. And it was costly, frankly. And I wanted to capture that in his story.
Linda Nisvisky has a question. What happened when there was a schism between the Blacks and the Jews who were so supportive and linked arms during the marches? You've sort of addressed this, but as I understand it, the Blacks wanted to take the battle on with only Black dissidents. Very sad how the groups have distanced themselves.
Yeah, so this is a familiar story that by the late 1960s, you see this alliance start to fracture. I'd say that narrative obscures that it was always, there's a lot of tensions all the time, but it certainly intensifies part. The question is referring to the Black Power movement, which starts to kind of distance itself at some level from some of these alliances. Within the Jewish community, there's also pullback, some because of battles over schooling that are taking place, some because of divisions over Israel in the 67 or the aftermath of the 67 war. But Heschel was pretty insistent not on allowing that to happen. So he's actually interviewed about this question. This is an interesting tidbit. He was giving a talk in the synagogue my father would become a rabbi in. And I found it like in one of these local New Jersey papers. And he's asked about that and about anti-Semitic language that some Black Power movement leaders had used locally. And he's obviously against that kind of language, and anti-Semitism is something he also fought against his whole life. But he's so determined, and he says that the alliance is absolutely essential in this broader fight for human rights in the country. There can't be a detour because of these kinds of frictions. And he never backs away from it. That is a firm response that these are not problems that should overcome what the movement had achieved. But beyond Heschel, yes, I think those divisions, and again, it's not simply the Black Power movement pulling away. It was a lot of the Jewish community pulling away, in part as these issues touched on their own communities and schools, that it's tragic. Because for me, the way in which Heschel saw the natural convergence of Jewish history, Jewish theology, and the struggle for racial justice, it's quite important. And it's sad that in the end, fractures and fights kind of overwhelm that to some extent. Although again, the Jewish community remains overwhelmingly liberal in terms of voting and support for some of these issues.
And Paul Newman asks, the two major parties are increasingly dominated by loud partisan extremists. Do you foresee morally driven Jewish religious leaders emerging on the national stage through some sort of national independent movement, if not a new political party?
It's a great question. That's like the two issues I study, or my main area of study is political polarization and these differences. And so there's always a question of how do you break out of it? I don't think somehow religious leaders will be the basis for, I'm not sure exactly where the question is going, but a third party movement. But I do think when people ask, how do you get outside a debate where you have parties and constituencies that can't even agree on the facts anymore, I think there's an important role to play for religious leaders. Religious leaders, not simply national religious leaders, but congregational leaders, have the ability to have conversations with congregants, to kind of stimulate interaction with people from different political views. That's still quite powerful. It's something political leaders, I don't think, can ever replicate. So I don't think it's going to be a third way. But what I do think is, if we are serious about how do you change some of the toxic discourse of our public square, and how do you encourage different kinds of conversations, religion is just a natural place to do it. And religion is framed around personal theological questions and communal questions of faith that get you outside the red-blue divide. And I often think it's not simply religion pushes you in one direction or another politically, but religion often still creates a space that's very different from the world of politics that frustrates so many Americans today. And I think it would be part of a healthier future.
As we say in Hebrew, Yirtzeh Hashem, or Hebrew Yiddish, and God, God willing. I don't see more questions. I think I saw a comment by Beth Chernoff in the chat. Ideological differences. I don't know what this was following up on something from before. Jews wanted to fight for equal employment and housing. Blacks wanted to concentrate on voting rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably in relationship to some of the challenges or the internal fights that happen. But again, the Selma March is about voting rights. So, I mean, there were few issues as powerful and uniting in civil rights politics as the right to vote, which is probably part of why, today, many in the civil rights community see it as so tragic to watch as that right is eroded and there's such sharp reversals in red states. I'd say the issues that really create more friction are actually, yes, maybe the question's reversed, but housing issues and schooling issues. Right here in New York, there's a pretty fierce debate in the late 60s about schooling, and then about busing and school integration in the 70s causes rifts. The right to vote, though, is actually one of the more uniting questions for civil rights activists. There's not a lot of division over that.
So I think we've come to a pause, and so and perhaps an end. So I just wanted to thank the audience for being here and joining us, and thank you, Julian Zelizer, for a really rousing, inspiring talk. And I'm gonna go back and read more of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I'm gonna read your book as well. So
Thanks
bravo,
so much.
and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.